Today we're joined by, I'll start with Lori Cohen Hackett. She's the president of the St. John Jewish Historical Society. And we're also joined by the executive director and curator of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum. That's Catherine Biggs-Craft. And they are going to present today on a glimpse into Jewish history in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, 1888 to 2021, I'm going with. So enjoy.
I'll kind of start with the building that's on the front. So we'll kind of go back and forth with time. And I'll have to do the presentation because Lori actually hasn't seen these slides. She's seen all the pictures at one time or another, but anyway, so we'll sort of start with now, go back to the beginning and then work our way sort of forward again. So the building that you see on the screen was actually built as a private house beginning in 1897. It was built by a fellow named, oh dear, Charles Peters. And he built this as a wedding gift for his wife. So ladies, your husbands may have some splaining to do why your house doesn't look quite as fancy as this. When it was built, it was one of the leading houses of the city. It was on the highest point in the center of the city. I think there were 5 bedrooms upstairs, formal dining room, living room. And it was a private home until the middle of the 1960s. There were only ever 2 families who owned it, Mr. Peters and his wife, who were the first residents. And when they died, the building was sold to Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Emerson. And Mr. Emerson was subsequently appointed to the Canadian Senate. We appoint our senators, we don't elect them. And so the status of this home went up a little bit more because the senator lived there. And after he died, his wife sold the building and it became a funeral home. And the building as a funeral home added a piece on the back, which is now our synagogue. And you'll see a picture of that toward the end of the slides. And it was a funeral home until about 2008. And in 2008, the St. John Jewish community had about 25 families. And mostly this was couples. Most of the children were already gone. And we'd had a much larger synagogue, which was too much to handle. And that building was sold. It's since been turned into office space by a company called Cook Aquaculture. And they did an absolutely beautiful job. They made it so nice, we almost wanted to go back. But instead, we're content where we are. So we have a synagogue that has a seating capacity of about 100 people. And at the moment, of course, we can't accommodate 100 people in that space because of all the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And the remainder of the bottom floor, so in the original house, is where we keep our museum. So the front door that you see, if you've been to the Jewish Museum, that's the door where you would have come in and then gone on your tour from there. I'm going to see if I can change the slide. Oops, there we go. And you can see that, I'm just going to see, if I click on that, will it disappear? Okay, good, that's better. All right, so you can see here pictures of Solomon Hart and Nathan Green. And these were the first 2 permanent Jewish residents in the city. They came with their families. Well, there was one fellow who did come after the American Revolution in 1783, but they didn't have cameras back then, so I don't have a picture of David Gable, who was a butcher and a baker. And after he died in, I think, 1816, that was kind of, the Jewish community had 1 family and then it went back to 0. And when Solomon Hart arrived in 1858 with his wife and children, he is recognized now as the first permanent Jewish resident of the city. And his brother-in-law, Nathan Green, joined him in 1859. So these 2 gentlemen had premises where they manufactured and sold cigars. Solomon Hart's wife, Alice, came with him. Nathan Green came with wife and children. And these families became further connected because Solomon Hart's daughter, Elizabeth, and Nathan Green's son, Lewis, married in 1882, and this was the first Jewish wedding in St. John. And the newspapers of the day, and I think at that time the city had 3 or 4 newspapers, and at least 3 of them devoted something in the order of 30 to 40 inches of newspaper column, which is, you know, the full length of the newspaper, plus maybe a bit more, to describing the wedding, what people, and of course what you would expect, what people wore and who was there. They noted down what the rabbi had to say to the bride and groom. They talked a bit about the ceremony. And the interesting thing was the only thing they would not talk about in the newspaper story were the gifts that Louis and Elizabeth received because of the value of them. They didn't want to make any other bride in the city jealous, apparently. So I guess this was the event of the year. There are still descendants of Nathan Green in St. John, no longer in the cigar business. Sometime probably in the 50s or 60s, they began to move beyond that. And so 7 generations on, it's actually now a shoe store. So a bit of a switch. Oops. Okay. So that first wave of immigration, the Greens and the Harts had come from England. And the next generation of immigration was coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Lithuania, from Russia, and it included many, many families. I've just pulled out pictures of 2 of them. That would be typical of the period, the Boyaner family. And Mr. Boyaner was an optician, so he sold glasses, diagnosed glasses, and these are some of his children. I think there were a couple of others that weren't born at this point. And the other picture is the Tansman family. And one of the little children in the front, I can't remember if it's the little boy with the curls sitting on the box or the little one sitting on the lap, who grew up to become one of the first Jewish doctors in St. John, Dr. Joseph Tansman. So of course, when the Eastern Europeans came, and you would know this from your parents or maybe your grandparents, they came with very little. They came to escape persecution, and they began mostly as peddlers, so carrying goods into the countryside, making what money they could to do 2 things: to bring the rest of their family, their wives, their children, their parents, their siblings, whoever, and they gradually moved into opening small stores. So Mr. Tansman, the doctor's father, had a store. I think it was a clothing store. Mr. Boyaner had his optical shop. There were a lot, and the Jewish community ultimately ended up being able to sell just about everything you would need. So food, clothing, shoes, furniture, the whole thing. So the community with Eastern European immigration by 1920 consisted of about 200 families. There were 200 male members of the congregation. And if everybody had a wife and everybody had children, and there were a few families that had as many as 10 or 12 of them, you can imagine it was quite a big community. By the 1940s, we were beginning to see Holocaust survivors coming to St. John. And we probably had about 24 approximately Holocaust survivors. I'm still working out some of the stories. But we have the Fisher family, Dr. Walter Fisher and his wife Ilsa and their daughter Renata. This is a picture from Renata's wedding in 1953, I think it was. And they were able to escape Europe just at the beginning of the war. So within a year of the war's beginning. And the other photograph was taken actually in the displaced persons camp, I think at Bergen-Belsen, of Albert Rose and Sidney Featherman. So Sidney Featherman was about a year old when the family came into Canada through Halifax in November of 1948. And Mr. Featherman, the father, was a tailor. And I have a photograph of him sitting at a sewing machine in his workplace. And it's one of my favorite pictures. I didn't include it because I also find this one very interesting, that in 1948, they're still behind wire. It's very unusual, I guess. But we did have survivors who went through the camps, as the Feathermans had. We also had people who escaped the Holocaust as what we referred to as enemy aliens. So we had 2 men who ended up in St. John who had been refugees from Germany going to England, and were then rounded up as enemy aliens and potential security risks. And the enemy aliens were put on board ships, brought to Canada, and placed in internment camps, and survived that way. The 2 men that settled here were young, were sponsored to go to university, and once everything settled down and they completed their education, they were able to carry on. It was a community, as I said, of 200 families by 1920. So between 200 and 300 families until the 1960s. And then we ran into a bit of a problem, because the children or grandchildren of the immigrants, as they came of age, left St. John for other opportunities, for university, for employment, and we're going to some of the other places in the pole. So to Toronto, to Montreal, to Vancouver, some to the United States. And as they left, the community shrank because that next generation was mostly gone. The parents either died or followed their children. And as I said, in 2008, we were down to about 25 families here. And didn't look like there would be any rebuilding, but the community did turn to immigration. And we've welcomed about 30 or 40 families coming here from Israel in search of new opportunities for employment, to raise their children in a safe place. So these are a couple of photographs from a picnic and I think a Passover Seder. It just gives you an idea of what, instead of a community full of people with gray hair, we also now have young children and babies and young families. And up until the pandemic hit, children running through the building almost every day. So now we'll go back to the past a little bit. And we've had 4 separate buildings as synagogues. So there was the building that was on the opening slide, but there were also 2 earlier synagogues. The one on the left, the Ahavath Ahim, was established in 1899, and it was established mostly by the Jews who had come from England. As the community grew, by 1906, they needed a second space. And it wasn't just in terms of numbers that they needed a little more room for people to attend services. There was also a cultural and linguistic difference between the Jews from England and the Jews from Eastern Europe. So the Jews from England purchased and moved into what became the Hazen Avenue Synagogue. It was a pre-existing building. And they gave that early wooden structure, the Ahavath Ahim, to those coming from Eastern Europe. And these 2 congregations worshiped separately until 1918, when they purchased this building, the Chasidic Synagogue. At the time that they purchased it, it had been built as a Presbyterian church. That congregation had reorganized itself, had joined with other congregations. And so we had a space that seated upwards of 500, 600 people, and on 2 levels. So you can see in the color picture, there was a main floor and then an upstairs balcony. The women and children were upstairs in the balcony until the 1960s, when the community moved from being an Orthodox community to conservative, which allowed everybody to sit down on the main floor together. The main floor at that time of purchase would have been furnished with wooden pews, but they were changed for theater seats in the 1960s. And so this was the space the community had. So this was where all the weddings took place, the bar mitzvahs, the bat mitzvahs, holiday services. And then downstairs from this, on the street level, was a large social hall where all the dinners took place. The kids played games, they played basketball, they had meetings. Everything happened in that building. It was interesting with the renovation. If you walk in there, as Lori and I have both done, of course, all the theater seats are gone. and the bima, of course, is gone. So they have some open space there for people in that building to meet together. So they've built offices in underneath the balcony, and they put office space up inside the balcony. And the one thing I noticed in those very uncomfortable 19th century pews are used as the visitor seats in some of those upstairs offices. So probably some encouragement for people not to be socializing too much if they don't want to sit on a hard wooden bench. I might rather sit on a nice comfy office chair. So this gives you some ideas of some of the things going on in the synagogue. So beginning in the 1950s, they had girls' confirmation classes, teenage girls in nice white dresses, and ultimately leading by the 1970s, I think, to individual bat mitzvahs. And then, of course, bar mitzvahs. So we have Ellis and Daniel Levine posing on the bima with the Torah in the 1980s. There we go. There were a lot of men's organizations. So we had a B'nai B'rith organization in the 1950s. And these, I think, were the original organizers of that. I recognize some of the faces. I can't stick names on them off the top of my head, and the community was also very active in fundraising for Israel. So every year there were State of Israel bond dinners or Negev dinners. And a lot of the dinners were held in a nearby hotel called the Admiral Beatty Hotel. And they would have had these dinners there, bar mitzvah dinners, all sorts of things in what they called the Georgian ballroom. Very fancy. You can see everybody got dressed up, tuxedos. If ladies would have had long dresses, that sort of thing. Okay. And of course, the women were involved in a lot of things. So they had the Hadassah, so including, and they would host regional conventions from time to time, including in 1986. And this must have been the banquet because they look very fancily dressed. And again, back in that Admiral Beatty Hotel. And Hadassah was probably one of the most active organizations in the community, involved, I think, almost every woman in the community. And they held all sorts of activities. In addition to the conventions, they would have raised funds with teas and bazaars and fashion shows and dinners. It was just busy all the time. And the Sisterhood staged a program in the 1950s called the Jewish Home Beautiful. And it's a presentation, if any, maybe some of you have done it, of all of the different Jewish holidays through the years. So the table is set and there's a narrator. This one was done in the 1950s, and the Jewish Museum recreated that event, I think, a couple of times. And the last one we held, we did it in a school theater, and we had a bake sale attached to it. And we had a number of really wonderful bakers, and we had everything laid out, and we were sold out in 10 minutes. So it was a fun way to spend the intermission. Just a little bit more on Hadassah and Sisterhood. So you can see the Bazaar in 1970, they rented space. We have what we call the Barrack Green Armory, so a military structure for army practice kind of thing. And they rented the entire space for this bazaar, and the people waiting to get in were lined up around the block. And I suspect this baking table probably didn't last for too long through the day before it was sold out. And we also were doing a lot of outreach programming. So, for example, the Sisterhood ladies went to one of the local churches and did a demonstration on how the Sabbath works. And the kids were busy. So the Young Judaea was established about 1917, around the same time as Hadassah. So a couple of pictures from the 1950s and 1960s. The executive, so teenagers, young adults taking leadership, and annual conferences, usually how most of the ones I found sort of happened between Christmas and New Year's. So over the school Christmas break. And you can see, you know, a couple of hundred kids. So there would have been kids here from all over the Maritimes. So St. John, Fredericton, Moncton, Halifax, Sydney out in Cape Breton, and a number of little towns in between. And the kids would come together once a year and talk about Israel and share information. We also had Boy Scouts and Cubs from the 1930s through to about the 1970s, I guess, was the end of it, when there were no Jewish kids really coming along, form their own group. But again, very active with Jewish leaders, and there were men in the community who led the Cubs and the Scouts on a regional, provincial level. So for all of the Scouts of whatever congregation or type of congregation or community that they came from. And of course, if you have Boy Scouts, you have to have Girl Guides. So that would have started in the 1930s with Mrs. Brownberg. And the last group of Brownies probably dates from about 1959, 1960. And these girls are all gathered together on one of the family's lawns, and they're getting organized. They're actually, this picture dated from a point these girls were heading off to Fredericton, New Brunswick. And they were going there because Queen Elizabeth was visiting from England, and they were going off with everybody else to see the Queen. I don't know that they were very close, but I'm sure it was very exciting for a bunch of girls who were 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And Jewish community in the 1950s also had a theater group, and there were all sorts of people involved within the Jewish community who dressed up and performed on the stage, or who were working behind the scenes with costumes and makeup and stage direction and all of that sort of thing. So these are a couple of the plays that they put on. Dr. Mo Pollowin directed them during that time. He had come to St. John from Ottawa. He was a doctor, so probably recruited to fill a gap at the hospital. Brought his love of theater with him and managed to enlist the support of the community to put on plays. And they were always had a sold out audience that they probably could have played for a week or 2 weeks for a run instead of just 2 or 3 nights. Businesses. This is the thing that probably the Jewish community here is most noted for, were their stores. And over the entire history of the community, from the 1850s until, well, maybe now, I guess, there were probably over 200 different Jewish businesses, and some of them may have been the same owner and just redirecting what he wanted to do, moving from one product to another, rebranding. But I just picked out a few pictures here and there. So Green's cigar store. Remember, I talked about Nathan Green when we started out. So this is his son and grandson managing the store on Charlotte Street. The American Clothing House was started by the Isaacs family, and the Isaacs were the third family who settled in the city. Had started out with cigars, and then by the second generation transitioned to clothes. In this case, men's clothing, and kept that going for a number of years. Shoe store, so the factory shoe outlet, wasn't a very big place and wasn't very fancy. I have a number of advertisements from there that they would have some opportunities where you could buy a really nice pair of shoes for 99 cents. Couldn't imagine doing that now. They'd be apart before you left the store, and advertised relentlessly. And then Hoffman's, which was in the north end of the city, was a ladies' wear store. It was one of the last stores that survived, but sold beautiful clothes, high-end clothing shop. Oh, I have a couple of more. And then sort of more family-oriented stores. So the Ideal Store, which a lot of people remembered on Union Street, family clothing, family shoes. And then the other store, the Fairville Department Store, was on the west side of the city. So we were spread out a little bit. And about, gosh, it's got to be 30 years ago, more. Hollywood came to St. John and made a film called Children of a Lesser God. Some of you may have seen it, set in a school with a teacher and I think a deaf student. And they were looking for different locations around the city to carry the plot along. And one of the places they chose to sort of have as a store was the Fairville Department Store. So somewhere in that film, this store does turn up pretty much as is, because when they set it up in the 1920s, it really didn't change. So when it closed in 1995, it still looked very much the same, just plain wooden shelves, a tin ceiling, I think, scuffed up hardwood floors, plain shelves, and it had gone from being family clothing to sort of men's working wear, because this building was surrounded by a couple of paper mills, a brewery, so a lot of working men who needed, work boots and work clothes kind of thing. So yeah, if you have that movie, you can look for the store. I just don't recommend you watch the movie with me, because I pretty much ignore the plot and just watch it for the scenery, and pick out the things and the people that I know. During the Second World War, we had about 75 members of the community who enlisted in every branch of the service. So for example, Libby Cohen was a member of the Canadian Women's Army Corps, so in an office somewhere, but still performing an important role. And Dr. Joseph Tansman, and you can see after his name, I've put the letters OBE. And after the war, he received the Order of the British Empire in recognition of his war service. He had traveled more or less behind the army in a medical role, so patching people up. Wasn't really supposed to come under fire, but did come under fire, I think, on at least one occasion. And he did carry a gun. I think he kept it after the war, and I think later when he died, his children donated it to a museum or disposed of it in some fashion. They didn't keep it. Lewis Green served in the Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserve. Naomi Bessedski served as a nursing sister with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And she was posted to Labrador, which is on the eastern coast near Newfoundland. And there was an American Air Base there at Gander Goose Bay. And there's actually a photograph of her in a book that was put together by an American. I can't remember his name. And the whole book is online. So it was quite interesting to find that. And she married after the war and moved to Halifax. One last slide on the war vets. During the Second World War, St. John, as some of you may realize, is a port city. And it was a sort of an entry and exit point for members of the services in all the branches, Army, Navy, Air Force. And there were a lot of Jewish men who were shipped in and out and through St. John. So Mrs. Bramberg and Rabbi Babb put together the Jewish Service Center in 1944. The men or the service members could go there, have coffee, cake, maybe meet a nice girl, go out dancing, whatever it might be, and have some homegrown hospitality. And Mrs. Bramberg also opened her home to service members. So they were coming to her house. She was feeding them dinner. She was letting them read her books, listen to her records. And she kept a guest book. And we have one of, I think there were 3 guest books altogether, and we have one of them. And then Major Frank Boyaner I've included because out of those 75 people that were enlisted and went off. Some went overseas, some didn't. He was the only one who did not return after the war. He died, not in battle, but of illness. He was a member of the Dental Corps, and again, like Dr. Tansman, traveling behind the army, patching people up, had traveled up through Italy. By January 1945, he was back in England. He was on the list. They decided he had done enough. They were going to send him home. But he got sick and he died and is buried in England. He had also married, so he did have a war bride, had married an English girl. And she came on her own to New Brunswick, to St. John, and stayed with his family for a year. She didn't know them, they didn't know her, but she came for a year. And before she went back, and that was that. But I just like to mention him because out of all of those people, the odds of only losing one are pretty good, I guess. We have notable residents, and you're going to recognize maybe at least these first two, perhaps. Louis B. Mayer, who everybody knows. And pictured here in the center, he's sitting here. The man with the dark suit. To the left of the image is Abraham Smith, who had a film distribution company in St. John. And then Louis B. Mayer. And on the other side is Walter Golding, who was the manager of the Imperial Theater, which showed the films. And Louis B. Mayer was visiting St. John, I think this is 1936, and had come back to visit. The film distributors gave a nice lunch for him, and they were able to get this lovely picture. But Louis B. Mayer and his family had come to St. John in the 1890s as peddlers. His father was dealt in scrap metal, and they dealt in scrap until Louis, being in Boston, bought a movie theater, saw an opportunity, fixed it up, needed movies, went to New York, learned how to make films. And in those days, I guess making films in New York was complicated by winter. So ended up in California and, of course, discovered everybody. And he came back to St. John a couple of times to visit after he had left. And Nathan Cummings, we've all, if not encountered directly, certainly indirectly. He came to St. John, humble beginnings. I think he was initially in shoes, but his career took him to Chicago, where he earned the title of King of Groceries. And he owned Consolidated Foods, and that included companies like Cane's and Electrolux and I think the Piggly Wiggly grocery stores and a few other things. So he was quite the entrepreneur, and he was also an art collector. To bring it back a little closer to St. John, the city has had one Jewish mayor in its 200 and some odd year history, Samuel Davis. And he's pictured here with the robes of office, which I'm not sure anybody wears anymore, and the chain of office as well. And he served one term as mayor, so for 3 years. And he also served, I think, 6 or 7 terms as a city councilor and on several boards around the city, and remembered by everyone as quite the gentleman. The lady you see here, the Honorable Erminie Cohen, grew up in St. John, was politically active, and in the early 1990s was called to accept an appointment in the Canadian Senate. The story as I have it is that the Prime Minister gives you the phone call, and the Prime Minister of the day called her, and she didn't believe it was him. She thought somebody was pulling her leg, I think, at first. And when she realized it was really true, and she turned to her husband and said, well, what should I do? He wants me there on Tuesday. And this was only a couple of days away. And he basically looked at her and said, well, get your bags packed and off you go. So she focused a lot of her issues around poverty and women's issues and that sort of thing. And when she was retired from the Senate, mandatory retirement at age 75, She spent another 15 or 16 years being very involved with organizations around the city. Everybody wanted her on her board, but she chose just a few that really meant something to her. And at the time of her passing, she was living in a senior's home, and it did not surprise me to discover that she was the president of the Residents' Council. So very much a take charge type of lady, but very kind, very encouraging, young, old, anybody from any part of life. So it was very special to us. And we've had to do without her. She passed away about a year ago, but still quite missed. Here are a couple of others. Ella Grossweiner, who was appointed as the first cultural affairs officer in the city of St. John, so promoting art shows and artistic endeavor. And the Honorable Myra Freeman, and she was appointed to the province of Nova Scotia lieutenant governor's position. So in Canada, each of the provinces has a lieutenant governor, and that person's role is to stand in for the Queen at any number of official events. And that was the role that she had. She grew up in St. John, had this role in Nova Scotia. I think she was on the job for about 6 years. And during her time, opened up the house, made it accessible to the people. And again, a very lovely lady. And Alice Hart, who was the first Jewish woman in the community. And Alice really, she looks quite formidable in this picture, I must say. I think I would be terrified of her. I think if she walked into the room right now. However, she founded a day nursery for children in the community. She established the first Jewish organization, the Daughters of Israel. She was involved with Jewish immigration, very busy, very active. And the other lady, Marcia Cohen, is the reason why we're all be able to have this conversation, because Marcia founded the St. John Jewish Museum in 1986. And she had begun collecting things, had everything in a little art studio in a building surrounded by artists and a rock band and a writer, I think. And we started out with a little gallery space kind of thing, moved into what was then the Jewish Community Center, and built over time. And she's now retired and living in Toronto. And she's left me the responsibility of taking care of the community's history. Very large shoes to fill, I must tell you. But we found each other in a university. She had gone back as a mature student, so she's wearing her Bachelor of Arts robes here. And we shared a class. And one day during the break, she said, "Oh, my plans for the summer? Oh, I'm applying for a grant. I'm going to hire a student and open a museum." I applied. I was the only applicant. And I'm still here. And I still call her from time to time and pick her brain when I need to find out about something that happened before my time. So the museum, this is what it looks like now. So the permanent exhibit. So we do have exhibits on the Jewish way of life from the cradle to the grave. And we do get a lot of non-Jewish visitors. We get school groups, church groups when we're able to, and hopefully we'll soon be able to do again. So we explain all of the Jewish customs and traditions that they're not familiar with. And we also show them our synagogue. And you can see it's a smaller space, it's a little cozier. The ark that's sitting on the bima is the same ark that we brought from the synagogue that we closed in 2008. And the same reading desk, the same theater seats. Taste not, want not kind of thing, I guess. So we have everything here that we need. And we use this space as well for educational programming, events, activities, and of course, services. So that's what I have. So I have questions. Now, before I answer the questions, you'll have to excuse me for 1 second. I have a student who comes to work with me, and I think she didn't get my email telling her how to sneak into the building because she's standing on the doorstep. So Justin, if you'll forgive me, I'll be right back. But this will give you time to think of all your questions. I'll be right back.
I'm an expert on St. John, so ask away. Ask away. More like the St. John Red Storm. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, we'll wait for her to come back. And yeah, if you want to, as I said, if you want to ask your question by raising your hand, you can do that. We'll have her, unshare her screen, or if you prefer to do it in the chat, wherever you're comfortable with, to ask Catherine and Lori. Yeah, so.
Sorry about that. I am back. So do we have any questions, Justin?
Yeah, we do, Catherine. If you want to just unshare your screen, then we can kind of see everyone.
Oh, okay, let me just.
Okay. Yeah, and so I'll read
Yeah, there's everybody. Hello.
All right, so here's a couple from the chat. And again, if you feel free to put more questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we can do it that way. But Sheila would like to know, I think Sheila, I think you'd been to St. John before, perhaps, but not to the museum, not to the museum. She's asking, is the congregation still conservative, and is there a permanent rabbi?
The community is still conservative community. It's also egalitarian. So the men and women are both counted towards making the minyan. As much a move with the times as a necessity in a community with a very small population. There has not been a permanent rabbi here since 1983, but there are men in the community who have been conducting the services since that time. And so life goes on. The fellow who's doing it now is had done a lot of study. Up until this year, he was going to Florida in the winter and working with a rabbi there to study and learn and be able to share what he's learned, and it seems to work. So,
are those question? Are those services every Shabbat?
We try. Don't always get a full minyan, but I mean, basically, like for the last 9 months or 10 months, it's like, wow, people, yay! Get to see somebody, even if we can't sit down and pray together. But yeah, so we do have services every Friday night. And sometimes on Saturdays as well, if there's a need for it. We have one community member, I think, who's been sitting Shiva, and I think they had a special service on Saturday. Because like every place, we have to have contact information. And I just took a quick look at the page and noted the date. So
this comes from Margaret. She wants to know how many Jewish people still in St. John and how many belong to the synagogue.
Oh boy, I might have to get some help from Lori for this one. But we have probably about 50 families at this point, including the families who have been here for generations and the families who have come from Israel. So we probably have maybe 150 people. I think most people are somehow connected to the synagogue, either as members or their children come to Hebrew school. And even the ones who aren't formally affiliated, we kind of know who they are, where they are, and we talk to them once in a while. We still reach out, and they know the community's here if they need it.
Stan, do you want to?
He has to unmute himself.
Yep, Stan, there should be something on your screen to unmute. Stan's actually a resident of St. John.
I was wondering, that name looks familiar.
Y'all, I don't know, can y'all hear me, first of all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, yeah, I was born and brought up in St. John, educated in St. John. I was born there in 1933, so I think I go back before any of the people here assembled. Anyway, my father arrived in the 30s. Actually, pardon me, I was corrected by my wife, Doreen. who's beside me here, in 1923, excuse me, I was going to say, yeah, and my mother and my older sister arrived in 1925. He said, I get all the numbers right. Anyway, yeah, I was in St. John from the time of my birth through public school, high school, until I left for college, and that was in 1949. 1949, I went to Dalhousie, and I ultimately ended up in medical school and went on to study at McGill and practice in various places, including Hamilton, Ontario, and Fort Worth, Texas, and now our permanent home for the last quite a number of years is in Florida, and that's where I'm speaking to you at this moment. A lot of the people you've shown there, first of all, I have to say that was a beautiful presentation that you made. It was lovely and brought back a lot of memories, and I recognized faces and certainly a lot of names. So that was a lot of fun for me to go back all those years. The history of St. John really is remarkable in many ways. If you know, I was fortunate enough to have actually lived there and gotten to know many of the people and what they were doing and how they were doing it and so on. And so we showed a picture of Dr. Jansen. Well, he was our family doctor, and his office was right across from our house, as an example, where we lived in a 3-story house. We had the middle flat, top flat, I guess the top flat, and his office was directly across the street. And anyway, we were good friends. Everybody in the community was a good friend with everybody else because everybody knew each other, being such a small community. And I don't know what else I can tell you, except that it was a beautiful presentation, and I certainly enjoyed going back these many, many years to it. I have visited St. John at one time when we were driving through there, and I did get to the synagogue, the original Chasidic Synagogue, and I did attend a Friday night service, which was being held by can't remember his name now. Anyway, it was we did make a minyan, as I recall, so that was sort of fun. And that was high school. And I was there. Oh yes, I was there for a high school reunion. That was back in 19. Well, no, it'd be not year 20. It would be 1920. 1920. 1920, I guess it was. Anyway, so that's my little story, but it was a lot of fun to see all this history presented. Shouldn't have been 1920.
No, it was 21 years ago.
21 years ago. So, yeah, exactly. So 2020. Yeah, 2020. Okay, we got the numbers right. I didn't plan the presentation particularly.
It was 20 years ago.
20 years ago. It seems like a lifetime. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say, except it was a delight to be visiting all these pictures and all these people in a sense. So, yeah. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask me any questions, but in any case, I'll just say thank you for this wonderful presentation and hello to everybody. And by the way, on the same screen is our daughter, Leah Stoller, and from Houston. And so we're spread into the States. I have another daughter, Andrea Stoller, and she's also in Houston. She's Assistant Dean of Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and our daughter Leah is an attorney, and she's retired from a large law firm, which she's headed up as a managing attorney for many years. And so I think that pretty much covers our story, except the person sitting beside me here. I should keep her in mind, is my wife, Doreen. And Doreen comes from Hamilton, Ontario. And we got married in 1959. I got that date right, in 1959. And
We
So-
were introduced by Glace Bay.
Yeah, we were introduced by a friend of mine from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. And I was visiting Toronto one time, and she was teaching school there, teaching high school there. And we have lived in various places. I did my postgrad work at McGill in Montreal, and then I was on the faculty at McMaster University Medical School in Hamilton, Ontario, and as chief of the Department of Anesthesiology there. And we subsequently moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where I was chief of the department there, again, of anesthesiology, and I was on the faculty of anesthesiology at, what's the name? I'm trying to think.
Okay.
West Virginia.
In West Virginia, I was trying to think of the name of Morgantown, West Virginia, where the medical school was.
Yeah.
And so I guess that pretty much completes my little mini story. I didn't mean to take up so much of your time, but I thought it might be sort of interesting to go and tell you a little bit about myself. Since I'm the oldest person here, I think it's safe to say.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us and providing some more kind of firsthand stuff about St. John. Couple more questions. That I see, Sharon, you raised your hand as well. This is from Ellen, and she's asking, for anyone, Catherine, Stan, Lori, she's asking, have there been anti-Semitic issues in the St. John community historically or currently?
I think we're very lucky in our part of the world because we haven't. I mean, I'm sure in decades past there were, comments that are made, by the kids. And I know the community had a summer community outside the city in what was called Pamdenak. And I know there was one story, and it was a community, there were Jewish-owned cottages and not Jewish-owned cottages. And kids being kids, you want to take the shortest point between your house and your friend's house so you can get down to the business of swimming or boating or playing or whatever it is you're going to do. And some of the kids remembered having to go out and around by the road because they couldn't take shortcuts across the non-Jewish properties because the property owners objected. But certainly nothing like we see in other parts of the world or anything like that. So we've been very fortunate.
I just want to say that in my experience, I have never experienced any kind of anti-Semitism at all, ever, from all the years that I lived there. Well, which is 16 years from my birth until I graduated from high school. I graduated when I was 16 years old. And in those years, I've never received a single thing. I'm not even subtle, not even, maybe a hint of it from somewhere. It was wonderful that way. We lived in the north end of St. John all my life there.
Here's a question from Jean. We saw a lot of notable figures in the Catherine slides, and most of them were female. And just the question of, were there more males that might have made an impact in the history of St. John?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there would have been. There were a lot of people in business and in the arts. I just sort of picked ones that I knew I could speak to without having to clutter up the slides with words and notes and messages. So this just gives you another excuse to come to St. John and see the rest of the story.
This is from Maryland. Is French spoken in St. John?
It is. The province of New Brunswick, where we are, is an officially bilingual province, French and English. I'm English speaking, obviously. My French comes from school, and if it's written in front of me, I can kind of pick out the words, so I can read it a little bit. My speaking is dreadful. But children in this province do have the option of learning all in English or all in French or in some combination. My son actually also took Spanish, and his Spanish is probably better than his French. And we don't get a huge call to use Spanish except when we have cruise ships.
Okay. Sharon, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to thank Dr. Stoger for sharing his story, but I have a question for him. If you have so many relatives in Houston, what the heck are you doing in Florida?
Right, that's a difficult question to answer. It just we used to come here for vacations. My wife's family used to have a winter vacation in Florida on the Miami side. We're in Naples on the Gulf of Mexico, and but they used to go to the Miami beach area for many years. And that when I met my wife, that's where we went to visit them. We had to take a little few days in the middle of the winter. And so it was became a sort of a second place to come to. And I always liked being in the warm weather, even though I was born in the north. I really enjoyed the summer time that existed in the middle of winter if you came to Florida. And so that was really always my intent.
I have one more question for Catherine. Catherine, are you doing like oral history projects and archiving people's material for research purposes like they're doing in Houston at Rice University and U of H? Have y'all thought about, like, you could get an oral history of people like Stan who grew up there but are no longer there and have it in your records?
We do have archives. So I've probably, you can't really tell behind me with the shelves just because of the way the camera's angled, but I have about 50 boxes of archival material in this office. Every time Lori comes in, she's very impressed that I haven't been crushed by all of this. You never know one of these days, but we also have probably another couple of 100 boxes that we have stored off-site. So we do have documents, histories, genealogies, photographs, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of photographs. I've got about 6 unsorted boxes in here besides the other 50. We've also done oral history. Marcia Cohen did probably 40 or 50 interviews in the 1980s. And I've started doing it again, and then this pandemic thing kind of got in the way. But I'm sort of contemplating a project now where I may do some of these interviews using Zoom, because now I'm not sort of waiting for somebody to turn up at the museum to talk to them, but that I can talk to them wherever they are in the world.
Yes.
And just record the Zoom and put that into the archives. So depending on the other 6 projects that are clamoring for attention on my desk, that's in there. So I may just reach out to Mr. Stoller and ask him some questions and record it for posterity.
But don't forget, we helped you get them. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, I won't forget, Justin. I will.
Not really. I mean, here's from Anne in the chat. She's asking about the population of St. John and also the main economy of St. John.
The city population at the present time within the city boundaries, which is about 100 square miles, we have about 65 or 68,000 people. So it's even odds that your neighbors could have 2 legs or they could have 4, because we're all overrun with deer and raccoons and squirrels and everything else. With the surrounding communities, so the greater city population is about 125,000. Traditionally, and this is what Mr. Stoller might remember, is that it's traditionally a blue collar city. So we have a port, so container ships rolling in and out, and looking forward to the idea of having cruise ships come back and having people rolling in and out. But we have, I think, 3 paper mills, a couple of power plants, including a nuclear power plant. When all of the telephone technology got really wonderful, we started getting call centers. You know, those people who call you at dinner time to sell you things, or when your computer goes awry, or your Zoom doesn't connect, or you book a holiday. You could be talking to somebody in St. John. So, and of course we have a lot of retail, but traditionally it's an industrial city. Still is a bit, but.
And we'll take our last question here from Sandy.
Thank you. Catherine, what do you see as the future for the Jewish community? in St. John?
Oh, wow. Well, we certainly have it all in the boxes, so it won't be forgotten, that's for sure. I think for the families that have been here for generations that are slowly disappearing, the hope is with the families who have come from Israel that they will pick up the torch and keep on going. But I don't know, maybe I should let Lori answer this one.
That's a hard one. As Catherine said, we do have about 30 to 40 Israeli families who have moved here. So we had earlier families come and not, the match wasn't a good match and they've moved on or moved back to Israel. There are, from these Israeli families, there are a lot of children. When we were able to, we had a Hebrew school that had about 30, 35 kids every Sunday. With COVID, it's sort of drained us. We're not able to have the Hebrew school. We're not able to have social activities. We're not able to have the events that we've always had. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. Right now, these Israeli families who are our future are buying homes. They're working in St. John. They're having families, babies. They're bringing over family from Israel to live here. So we're hoping that we could make the match, that they will become part of the, many of them are members, but there's still others who are not. So we're hoping that we can draw them all in, that they will be our future.
Nothing from the United States?
No, from the States, no.
I think Carol has a question as well, actually.
Yeah, just one. Is my muting off?
Yep,
Yeah.
you're good. You're good.
Many years ago in 1958, I went to Camp Kadima, and I had a wonderful summer and met many of the people's families that you showed on this presentation. And I just wondered, is it still functioning?
Oh my, yes, it is. I think they had a 50th anniversary a couple of years ago. Where are you from?
I'm actually from Northern Ontario, so this is a very familiar story to me.
Yep, Camp Kadima is stronger than ever. And now it's like the children of the children, like your children and your grandchildren who are all over the country who are going to Kadima as well. And still the same cabins and the same ideas and the same everything. That's wonderful.
My husband was in practice in Montreal, and he was with Domboyaner.
Okay.
We all go back a long way. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's great. So what years were you at?
And I went to camp with the Tansman kids and
Okay.
Bonyaks, and yes, so we're all interrelated there.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That was a little before my time, but yeah, Camp Kadima was the place to go and still is.
Morris, would you like to say something?
Yes, Catherine, thank you so much for your presentation. My wife and I actually toured your museum in last week of June of 2015. It was amazing. I really enjoyed it. And then this was on a Friday, and we stayed for services that evening, and then went on to St. Andrews from there the next day. This was part of our Atlantic or Maritime Provinces tour. So we started off in Fredericton, then went to Charlottetown, then to Halifax, toured all of the provincial houses except in Charlottetown because it was under renovation. But really enjoyed our trip there. And I was just curious, when I saw the picture, the initial picture of the interior of the synagogue, I said, wow, it wasn't that elaborate. Then you explained what happened, and then you showed the the current one. So it was really nice. So what is the fascination of Israelis with St. John?
There was a program through the provincial government for immigration, and somehow we connected with an immigration lawyer in Israel, and who sort of made the connections. The Israelis came here on like a week's tour at their own expense to check it out. We showed them around, and then they went back to Israel. They got all their paperwork in order, and then they came back. I think part of it is that like my grandparents, they came from Lithuania, they came from Russia. Came to run away from things. I think the Israelis came, they wanted a different lifestyle. They wanted a quieter place to live and to raise their children. There's one story, one of the Israelis who had been here for a year or two went back to Israel, and his family said to him, "You're so different. We don't recognize you. You're calmer, you're quieter, you're softer. You know, if you know Israelis, they're in your face sort of thing." And he said, "Well, yes, I'm living in a place in 5 minutes. I can be out in the woods and the peace and the quiet, and I know my neighbors, and it's peaceful here. I'm becoming part of the community." So that's part of the draw. The other part is a lot of these Israelis are IT people, so they can live anywhere and work for companies wherever. And that's a lot of them are in the IT, and that's part of the draw as well.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I never learned that story when I was there. And just real quick, Catherine, we bought a beautiful tzedakah box at the museum, which we gave to our granddaughter. It was about this big, pink, and has 2 slots in it, one for tzedakah and one for her savings.
Oh my goodness, I think I remember that thing. Oh, wow. Well, you'll have to come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we can throw out the welcome mat in 2021. We may have to wait until everybody's had a couple of shots in the arm, and of course, our international borders still closed.
Mhm.
Actually, our borders to everywhere are closed. We're kind of cut off at the moment. I think you might have to rent a donkey or something to get in here, because we're down to a couple of planes. Our bus service is cut off. The cruise ships are parked. Yeah, so you may have to rent a pony and sneak through the woods. I don't know to get here until things settle down. But yeah, if I don't get a chance, we'll throw out the welcome mat, if not for 2021. I noticed somebody, I think in the chat, said they had purchased a cruise and had their fingers crossed. So hopefully, but if not, hey, we'll throw the welcome mat out in 2022, and we'll save Morris a seat in the synagogue for Shabbat services. And
Well, I need to make sure I don't go to St. John's. I always get those confused.
yeah, that would be good. There is a small Jewish community in Newfoundland, but yeah.
Cool. All right. Any other questions? I really want to thank, I guess we'll say, our trio of presenters. You know, we had Catherine, Lori, and also Stan kind of filling in some details as well. Really, thank you for, spending your Thursday morning with us. Up to, I think we had 72 people, which is another great turnout, which is great. And so you're probably all wondering, as Catherine, Lori, and Stan, we're doing kind of a Jews Around the World series. This stop was obviously St. John, our first time in Canada, and on Sunday, February 7th at 11 a.m., we are going to Luxembourg. So Rabbi Alexander Grodensky from the Liberal Jewish Center of Luxembourg is going to join us on Sunday, February 7th. So that's coming up next. So I'll stick around. We'll stick around if you have any other questions or anything, but have a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you all soon.